Is Ibrahim Traoré the new Sankara? His statement shocked the entire world. The Grand Hall of the United Nations General Assembly in New York hummed with the murmurs of expectation. Delegates from around the world adjusted their translation earpieces, ambassadors exchanged knowing glances, and journalists positioned their cameras strategically, all waiting for the next speaker. The room was adorned with flags of all nations, a tapestry of colors that represented the global community, yet the power dynamics beneath this veneer of equality were as stark as ever. The Republic of Burkina Faso, announced the session chairperson, President Ibrahim Traoré. A ripple of curiosity swept through the assembly. Many diplomats leaned forward in their seats, some reaching for their briefing notes. Ibrahim Traoré was still something of an enigma on the world stage. The young military officer who had assumed leadership of the West African nation following political upheaval. Whispers comparing him to Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader from decades past, had been circulating in diplomatic circles for months. Unlike many world leaders who arrived with entourages of advisors and security personnel, Traoré approached the podium alone. He wore a simple military uniform without ostentation, no medals, no elaborate insignia of power. His demeanor was calm, his gaze steady as he surveyed the assembly before him. Before speaking, he raised a book. The worn cover was instantly recognizable to those familiar with African political history. The Upright Man, the collected speeches of Thomas Sankara. The gesture sent a clear message even before he uttered a word. "This was my teacher," Traoré said simply, his voice resonating through the hall without a trace of nervousness. The customary diplomatic preamble was absent. No lengthy greetings to fellow leaders, no formalities. The interpreter paused briefly, perhaps surprised by the directness, then continued translating as Traoré spoke. "Africa was not born to be an eternal colony," he began, his voice gaining strength with each word. "For centuries we have been told that we need salvation from outside, that our problems require foreign solutions, that our development depends on external charity. Today, I stand before this assembly to question this narrative that has been forced upon us." The American delegation shifted uncomfortably. The French representatives exchanged glances. The British ambassador scribbled notes furiously. "You speak of aid and cooperation," Traoré continued. "Yet we remain chained by colonial debt systems that ensure we can never truly stand on our own. You offer technology, but withhold the knowledge to create it ourselves. You extract our resources, but question why we cannot build our own economies." The silence in the hall deepened as translators worked to keep pace with his increasingly passionate address. There was none of the polite diplomatic language that typically characterized UN speeches. Instead, his words cut through pretense, laying bare uncomfortable truths about neo-colonial relationships that persisted in the modern world. "They call us poor," Traoré said, gesturing to encompass the Western delegations. "Yet it is our wealth that sustains their world. Our gold, our uranium, our cotton, our cocoa, the resources that built their empires and continue to fuel their economies. The paradox of the poor African continent is that it remains the richest in natural resources." The American president, known for his brusque demeanor and transactional approach to international relations, leaned over to his Secretary of State, whispering something behind his hand. European leaders formed small clusters of hushed conversation. The usual protocol of attentive listening had given way to visible discomfort. Traoré continued undeterred. "In Burkina Faso, we have decided to follow the path illuminated by Thomas Sankara. We will produce what we consume and consume what we produce. We will build with our own hands, educate with our own minds, and heal with our own knowledge." His voice rose slightly as he approached the culmination of his address. "The era of puppets and proxies is over. We do not reject friendship with any nation, but we reject dominance by any nation. We do not reject cooperation, but we reject exploitation disguised as partnership." The final lines of his speech would soon be shared across social media platforms, analyzed in university classrooms, and debated in policy circles worldwide. "We do not want your handouts, we want our freedom," We do not need your pity, we need your respect. And make no mistake, we will have it, whether freely given or rightfully taken. With that, Traoré closed the book of Sankara's speeches, nodded once to the assembly, and stepped away from the podium. The traditional applause that followed UN addresses was scattered and uncertain. Some delegates rose to their feet in spontaneous appreciation, while others remained seated, faces unreadable. As he made his way back to his seat, the eyes of the world followed him. Something significant had just occurred, not merely a speech, but a declaration. Like Sankara before him, Ibrahim Traoré had used the world stage not to placate powerful nations, but to challenge them. The question hanging in the air was clear. Was this merely rhetoric or the beginning of something more consequential? Outside the UN building, autumn leaves scattered across the plaza as diplomats hurried to their vehicles, phones pressed to ears, urgently reporting what they had just witnessed. The world's most powerful nations had just been publicly challenged by one of its smallest, and no one quite knew what would happen next. Within hours of Ibrahim Traoré's address at the United Nations, the international media landscape erupted into a frenzy of analysis, criticism, and heated debate. The major news networks ran continuous coverage, their chyrons blaring sensational headlines. Burkina Faso defies the West with fiery UN speech. Traoré channels Sankara in diplomatic showdown. African leader rejects global order. In the gleaming headquarters of CNN in New York, a panel of experts gesticulated dramatically as they dissected every word of the speech. What we're seeing here is unprecedented in modern diplomatic relations, insisted a silver-haired former State Department official, his voice tense with concern. Traoré has essentially thrown down the gauntlet to the entire Western alliance system. Across the Atlantic, the BBC adopted a more measured tone, though the underlying anxiety was palpable. The comparisons to Thomas Sankara are unavoidable, noted a respected African affairs correspondent from her position in London. Both leaders share an anti-imperial rhetoric, both came to power through military means, and both appear determined to challenge long-established power structures. But it was on social media where Traoré's message truly caught fire. Video clips of the most pointed moments from his speech were shared millions of times within the first day. Young Africans across the continent and in the diaspora added passionate commentary. This is what real African leadership looks like. Sankara's spirit lives. The West is finally being called out on its hypocrisy. Universities from Johannesburg to Nairobi and from London to Paris hastily organized panel discussions. Academic experts who had studied Sankara's brief but transformative rule in the 1980s were suddenly in high demand, invited to draw parallels and contrasts between the two Burkinabe leaders. The similarities in rhetorical strategy are striking, explained a professor of African political history at SOAS University of London to a packed auditorium. But the geopolitical context is dramatically different. Sankara operated during the Cold War, when non-alignment offered a third path. Traoré faces a much more complicated landscape of global power. Meanwhile, behind the ornate doors of the Élysée Palace in Paris, the French President Emmanuel Macron paced his office, clearly agitated as his advisors delivered their assessment of the situation. This speech threatens our entire strategic position in West Africa, warned his foreign policy chief. If other former colonies begin to adopt similar positions, our access to uranium in Niger, timber in Gabon, and oil in Chad could all be compromised. Macron stopped his pacing and faced the assembled officials. Traoré completely disregards our efforts in the region. Decades of development aid, security cooperation, cultural exchange, all dismissed as neo-colonialism. This narrative cannot be allowed to take hold. He instructed his press secretary to prepare a statement that would walk the fine line between appearing respectful of Burkina Faso's sovereignty while firmly defending French interests and reputation. The resulting declaration, released that evening, described Traoré's speech as regrettably mischaracterizing the nature of French-African relations and overlooking the substantial benefits of international partnership. Across the ocean in Washington, D.C., the American response was more blunt. From his Mar-a-Lago resort, the U.S. president issued a characteristically direct tweet. Ungrateful Burkina leader wants to erase American history in Africa. We've given billions in aid, maybe they don't want our money anymore, America first. The State Department quickly followed with a more nuanced official statement, emphasizing America's continued commitment to partnering with African nations on their development journeys, while expressing concern about rhetoric that misrepresents the nature of international cooperation. At the United Nations headquarters, staff worked overtime as emergency consultations were called among various blocs. The UN spokesperson carefully avoided direct comment on Traoré's speech during the daily press briefing, merely acknowledging the passionate articulation of sovereignty concerns, while reaffirming the organization's commitment to respectful dialogue among all member states. Leading geopolitical analysts published urgent assessments. What we're witnessing is nothing less than the political reincarnation of Thomas Sankara, wrote a prominent columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. The question is whether Traoré will meet the same fate as his ideological predecessor, who was assassinated after just 4 years in power. The comparison sent chills through diplomatic circles. The circumstances of Sankara's death, widely believed to have been orchestrated with the tacit approval of Western powers, remained a sensitive topic in international relations. As the global media storm intensified, the response across Africa took physical form. In Dakar, Senegal, thousands of university students marched through the streets carrying hastily made banners declaring solidarity with Burkina Faso and Traoré speaks for all of Africa. Similar demonstrations erupted in Bamako, Mali, Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, and Lomé, Togo. In Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, the hashtag Traoré Truth became the top trending topic as millions of young people shared their own experiences of Western exploitation and expressed hope for a new era of truly independent African leadership. While the world debated his words, Ibrahim Traoré himself had already departed New York, declining all interview requests from international media outlets. His government plane touched down at Ouagadougou Airport as the sun was setting over the dusty capital city of Burkina Faso. Unlike the tense atmosphere in Western capitals, the mood in Ouagadougou was jubilant. Despite the late hour, thousands had gathered at the airport and along the route to the presidential palace. They beat drums, sang traditional songs, and waved the red and green national flag. Many carried printed screenshots of Traoré's defining moments at the UN podium, and the elderly man, his face weathered by decades under the harsh Sahel sun, stood watching the presidential motorcade pass. A journalist from the national broadcaster approached him for comment. "I was young when Sankara led us," the man said, his eyes glistening with emotion. "I never thought I would live to see another leader stand up to the world like that. Perhaps our grandchildren will know a Burkina Faso, an Africa, that truly belongs to Africans." As Traoré's vehicle passed through the cheering crowds, he appeared momentarily overwhelmed by the reception. This was no longer just about a speech at a distant forum in New York. He had articulated something that resonated deeply with his people and with millions across the continent. A vision of an Africa that would no longer accept its assigned role in the global hierarchy. The question that hung in the evening air, as the celebratory drums continued late into the night, was whether this moment of defiance could translate into sustainable change, and whether the powers that had been so directly challenged would allow such a transformation to occur. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ouagadougou's central marketplace as vendors set up their stalls for the day. Conversations hummed with unprecedented energy as people discussed the events of the past week. President Ibrahim Traoré's UN speech had transformed from a distant diplomatic event into something deeply personal for the citizens of Burkina Faso. "My brother, have you heard what they're calling him now?" asked a fabric merchant as he unfurled vibrant bolts of locally produced cotton. "The modern Sankara, and I say it fits him well." His customer, a school teacher, nodded in agreement. "In my classroom yesterday, the children wouldn't talk about anything else. They wanted to know everything about Sankara. Suddenly, our history isn't just in dusty textbooks, it's alive again." Throughout the capital city and beyond, a remarkable transformation was taking place. Murals began appearing on walls, depicting Traoré and Sankara side by side. Street vendors sold T-shirts bearing images of both leaders with the slogan, "The Revolution Continues." Radio call-in shows were flooded with listeners sharing emotional responses to the president's words on the global stage. In the rural heartland of Burkina Faso, where most citizens made their living from agriculture, Traoré's message resonated with particular force. Outside the village of Koudougou, farmers gathered in the shade of a massive baobab tree to discuss recent developments in the government's agricultural program. For years, they told us we needed imported seeds, imported fertilizers, imported machines, said one farmer, wiping sweat from his brow. Now the president's food sovereignty program is actually showing results. My millet yield has increased by 30% using traditional methods enhanced with new techniques developed right here in Burkina. Another nodded enthusiastically. And the best part? We own what we produce, no foreign company telling us what price we must accept. In primary schools across the nation, a curriculum shift was underway. History lessons that had once given cursory attention to Sankara now explored his vision in depth, paired with discussions of current policies. Children as young as 8 could articulate the connections between Sankara's revolutionary ideas and Traoré's current initiatives. President Traoré says we must build our country with our own hands, explained a bright-eyed 10-year-old girl in a classroom on the outskirts of Bobo-Dioulasso, Burkina Faso's second-largest city. My father has joined the Community Construction Brigade. They're building a new health center using local materials. This Build with Your Hands initiative had become one of the most visible manifestations of Traoré's vision. Throughout the Sio country, young people were being mobilized not as conscripts but as volunteers in national reconstruction projects. University engineering students worked alongside traditional builders, combining contemporary knowledge with time-tested techniques to create infrastructure that was both sustainable and culturally appropriate. Women's cooperatives flourished, under policies that deliberately echoed Sankara's progressive stance on gender equality. In the northeastern town of Dori, a women's shea butter collective had expanded operations to supply not only local markets, but also neighboring countries. Under Sankara, women were recognized as equal partners in building the nation, explained Fatimata Ouedraogo, the cooperative's leader, as she supervised the packaging process. President Traoré has restored that vision. We now have access to credit, technical training, and market channels that were previously closed to us. The impact extended beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In a historic summit held in Ouagadougou, Traoré launched the Africa Feeds Africa initiative, bringing together agricultural ministers from several West African nations. The program aimed to create regional food security systems independent of global market fluctuations. For too long, we have produced what we do not consume, and consumed what we do not produce, Traoré declared at the summit's opening ceremony. The phrase, a direct quote from Sankara, generated thunderous applause from the assembled delegates. Representatives from Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Ghana signed agreements to coordinate agricultural policies, share indigenous seed banks, and establish intra-regional trade corridors that would minimize dependence on European and American markets. Alternative media outlets across the continent provided extensive coverage of these developments, often juxtaposing images of Traoré's current speeches with archival footage of Sankara, addressing similar issues decades earlier. The visual similarities were striking. The same passionate gestures, the same straightforward language, the same refusal to adopt the polished but empty rhetoric of mainstream global politics. An elderly woman who had lived through Sankara's brief rule was interviewed on Burkina Faso's national television. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she spoke. It's like Sankara has returned to us. The same spirit, the same love for the people, the same courage to speak truth to power. I never thought I would live to see such days again. When shown this clip during a press conference, Traoré responded with characteristic humility. I am not Sankara, he stated firmly. No one can be Sankara again. I am merely a servant of Africa, trying to water the seeds he planted. The true comparison will be made not by words but by results, by whether we succeed in building a truly independent and prosperous Burkina Faso. Despite this modest disclaimer, the Sankara effect continued to spread throughout the continent. University students in Kenya formed study groups dedicated to analyzing Traoré's implementation of Sankara's philosophies. Youth movements in Zimbabwe and South Africa adopted slogans from both leaders in their campaigns for economic justice. In a particularly significant development, officials from several African nations that had traditionally aligned closely with former colonial powers began making quiet inquiries about potential cooperation with Burkina Faso on independent development projects. The Minister of Industry from Benin spent 3 days touring Burkina Faso's new textile factories, which processed locally grown cotton into finished products rather than exporting the raw material. What we're seeing here challenges everything we've been told about development, the Beninese minister admitted to reporters. They said we needed foreign investment, foreign expertise, foreign markets. Burkina Faso is demonstrating that there is another path. As evening fell over Ouagadougou, couples strolled through Revolution Square where a new exhibition chronicled the parallel journeys of Sankara and Traoré. The atmosphere was one of cautious hope, a sentiment captured by graffiti that had appeared on walls throughout the city. The era of puppets is over. In the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré worked late into the night, reviewing agricultural production figures with his advisors. The data showed promising trends, but also highlighted immense challenges ahead. The weight of expectation was palpable, not just from his own citizens but from millions across Africa, who had begun to see in him the continuation of a vision that had been violently interrupted decades ago. On his desk sat a well-worn copy of Sankara's speeches, bookmarked to a passage that Traoré had quoted often in private conversations. We must learn to live the African way. It's the only way to live in freedom and with dignity. Outside his window, the lights of Ouagadougou twinkled under the vast African sky. Something was stirring across the continent, a renewed questioning of long-accepted narratives, a collective reimagining of what African nations could be. Whether this awakening would lead to transformative change or be stifled like similar movements in the past remained to be seen. But for now, a powerful idea had taken root in the consciousness of millions. Perhaps the future need not mirror the past. The first warning came in the form of a diplomatic cable, delivered to Burkina Faso's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, exactly 3 weeks after Ibrahim Traoré's historic UN address. The language was couched in the careful syntax of international relations, but the message was clear. France was reconsidering its economic cooperation framework with its former colony. Inside the government compound in Ouagadougou, officials gathered in an emergency session to assess the implications. The French ambassador had already been recalled for consultations, a traditional diplomatic signal of displeasure. Now, the threat of economic sanctions hung in the air like the approaching Harmattan winds. They're threatening to freeze development funds, restrict trade access to EU markets, and suspend technical assistance programs, reported the finance minister, his expression grave. The estimated impact on our GDP could be as high as 12% in the first year. Similar notices arrived from other Western nations in quick succession. The United States announced it was pausing cooperation agreements due to concerns about political instability and governance issues. The World Bank cited uncertain investment climate as it delayed approval of infrastructure loans that had been in the final stages of processing. International news outlets framed these developments as the predictable consequences of Traoré's provocative stance and anti-Western rhetoric. A prominent French newspaper ran an editorial suggesting that Burkina Faso's leader was sacrificing his people's welfare on the altar of ideological posturing. The response came not through diplomatic channels, but directly to the people. A sweltering evening with the temperature still hovering above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the setting sun, President Traoré addressed the nation in a broadcast carried by radio to the furthest villages. He stood not behind a formal desk, but in the open courtyard of a community center in one of Ouagadougou's working-class neighborhoods. Nearby, children paused their games to listen, and elderly residents gathered around communal radios, their expressions intent. "My fellow Burkinabé," Traoré began, his voice steady and resolute, Today, I must inform you that the path we have chosen, the path of true independence, and will not be without obstacles. Those who have profited from our dependence are not surrendering their advantages without a fight. He detailed the economic threats that had been levied against the country, reading directly from the diplomatic communications rather than paraphrasing them. This transparency, another echo of Sankara's approach, stood in stark contrast to the typical secrecy surrounding international negotiations. "We are being punished," he continued, "not for failing to follow democratic principles or human rights standards, but for daring to question an economic order designed to keep us subordinate. I ask you now, will we bend to these pressures? Will we return to the comfortable chains of dependence?" The crowd that had gathered around him responded with a resounding "No." The sound carried through the broadcast, echoing across the nation. "Then, I make you this promise," Traoré declared, his voice rising with emotion. "We will not bow. We will not kneel. We will stand upright as Sankara taught us. The road ahead will demand sacrifices from all of us, but the dignity we gain will be worth more than the comforts we might temporarily lose." International reaction to the speech was swift and polarized. Western analysts characterized it as doubling down on confrontation and economic self-sabotage. But across Africa and much of the global South, Traoré's defiance resonated powerfully, particularly his direct challenge to the mechanisms of economic control that had long constrained developing nations. In the weeks that followed, Traoré took his message beyond Burkina Faso's borders. He embarked on a tour of neighboring countries, meeting not only with governmental officials but with student groups, farmer cooperatives, and community organizations. At each stop, he spoke candidly about the challenges of breaking dependency, relationships, and invited regional cooperation outside traditional frameworks. "The colonial borders that divide us are artificial," he told a gathering of agricultural workers in Mali. "Before Europeans carved up our continent, trade routes connected our peoples from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. We can rebuild those connections, but this time on our own terms." This Pan-African vision culminated in a historic summit held in Ouagadougou, deliberately organized without Western observers or funding. Leaders from Ghana, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and representatives from several other nations assembled to discuss alternative development models and regional self-sufficiency. The summit opened with Traoré's most provocative speech yet. Standing before his African counterparts, he systematically dismantled the narrative of international debt that had constrained the continent's development for decades. "They speak of the debt we owe them," he declared, his voice echoing through the conference hall. "But the true debt is theirs to us. The wealth extracted from our mines, our forests, our farms, wealth that built their cities and industries while our people remained in poverty. The human capital stolen through centuries of slave trade. The cultural treasures that fill their museums while our children learn history from their perspective." He proposed a radical reframing. "We must cease thinking of ourselves as debtors and recognize ourselves as creditors in a historical accounting that has never been settled." The statement, live-streamed across the continent despite attempts by several international platforms to restrict its distribution, generated intense debate in academic circles and policy forums worldwide. Economic historians from universities in Brazil, India, and South Africa published analyses supporting Traoré's position, with detailed calculations of colonial-era resource extraction. Behind the scenes, the pressure campaign against Burkina Faso intensified. Intelligence reports suggested covert efforts to identify and exploit divisions within Traoré's government. Suspicious financial transactions indicated possible attempts to fund opposition groups. The specter of Sankara's fate, assassinated, in a coup widely believed to have had foreign backing, loomed large in security briefings. Traoré addressed these concerns directly in meetings with military leadership and civilian advisors. "They will try to divide us," he warned. "They will look for weakness, for corruption, for ambition they can manipulate. Our unity is our strongest defense." The government implemented security protocols while being careful to avoid the authoritarian measures that could alienate the population. Traoré continued to move openly among the people, though his security detail was discreetly enhanced. "The day I hide behind palace walls is the day I have already lost," he told his concerned advisors. As economic pressure mounted, Burkina Faso's government accelerated programs aimed at self-sufficiency. Agricultural initiatives expanded from food production to include processing and storage technologies. Education reforms emphasized practical skills alongside theoretical knowledge, with university engineering departments tasked with developing appropriate technologies for local conditions. Most remarkably, young Burkinabe technologists, inspired by Traoré's call for digital sovereignty, began developing independent communication systems. Operating from makeshift labs in university buildings and community centers, they created a decentralized network that could function even if international connections were severed. "They control the infrastructure of global communication," explained a young woman leading one such initiative, her fingers flying across a keyboard as she demonstrated the system to visiting officials. "This means they can silence voices they don't want heard. We're building alternatives that they cannot so easily control." The concept spread rapidly across borders, with young technologists from neighboring countries adapting the model to their own contexts. What began as a practical response to potential sanctions evolved into a broader movement for digital independence across the region. 6 months after his UN speech, Traoré addressed an international press conference, his first formal engagement with global media since the escalation of tensions. Journalists from major networks came expecting either a capitulation or further inflammatory rhetoric. Instead, they encountered a leader who spoke with measured confidence about concrete achievements. "You asked whether our approach is sustainable. In the face of international pressure," he responded to a question from a CNN correspondent. "Let me share some figures with you. Our agricultural production has increased by 22%. Local manufacturing now supplies 60% of our textile market, up from just 15% last year. School enrollment has reached the highest level in our history." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "But the most important metric cannot be quantified. It is the dignity of a people who are beginning to believe that they can shape their own destiny." As the press conference concluded, Traoré delivered the statement that would define this phase of his leadership. "I have been called the new Sankara since I took office. It is an honor I have not claimed for myself. But today I make this pledge. I will not be Sankara only in speeches and symbols but in actions." The revolution he began will continue, not as a distant memory, but as a living reality. The words spread across social media platforms and through traditional community networks. In villages and urban neighborhoods, they were received not as mere political rhetoric, but as a solemn commitment to a vision that many had thought was buried with Sankara decades ago. That evening, as the red sun set over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the city's mixture of traditional and modern structures, a sense of both determination and apprehension pervaded the capital. The path forward remained uncertain, fraught with dangers both apparent and hidden. But there was also a palpable feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that regardless of what challenges lay ahead, the narrative of what was possible for Burkina Faso, and perhaps for Africa, had been irrevocably changed. 2 years had passed since Ibrahim Traoré stood at the United Nations podium and challenged the world order. The Harmattan wind swept across Ouagadougou, carrying fine desert dust that coated everything in a reddish haze, symbolic of the changes that had transformed Burkina Faso in that relatively brief span of time. In the central market, Mariam Ouedraogo arranged locally grown tomatoes at her vegetable stall while chatting with a regular customer. "Before, these would come from Europe, even though we can grow them here," she explained, gesturing to the vibrant produce. "They would arrive half-rotten, after days in transit, and still cost more than what our farmers now earn selling them fresh." Her customer, a young teacher, nodded in agreement. "My students are learning about our agricultural revolution in real time. Yesterday, I took them to visit the community garden that supplies our school canteen. They picked vegetables they had planted themselves." These conversations, multiplied across thousands of market stalls, classrooms, workshops, and homes throughout the country, reflected the tangible impact of policies implemented since Traoré's defiant stance on the global stage. Government data, verified by independent researchers who had initially been skeptical, confirmed a remarkable transformation. Burkina Faso had reduced its dependence on food imports by 60%. The journey had not been without significant hardships. The economic sanctions threatened by Western powers had indeed materialized, though not as severely as initially feared. Several development aid programs had been suspended, international banking relationships complicated, and preferential trade agreements revoked. For months, essential imports like medical supplies and specialized equipment had been difficult to obtain. Yet these pressures had accelerated rather than deterred the country's push toward self-reliance. When pharmaceutical imports became unreliable, the government had partnered with traditional healers and modern scientists to expand local production of medicines from indigenous plants. When fuel shortages threatened transportation networks, community-based solar charging stations for electric vehicles had multiplied across the country. Most significantly, young Burkinabe citizens had stepped forward to fill crucial roles in their society. Engineers who might once have sought careers abroad instead focused on developing appropriate technologies for local challenges. Agricultural scientists worked directly with farmers to improve traditional methods rather than imposing foreign techniques. Teachers redesigned curricula to emphasize practical knowledge alongside academic learning. In the village of Kaya, about 100 kilometers northeast of the capital, a remarkable example of this new approach was visible in the community health center. Sunlight streamed through windows strategically placed to maximize natural lighting as Dr. Aminata Diallo showed visitors through the facility. "We designed and built this center ourselves," she explained with evident pride. "The architecture uses traditional cooling methods combined with modern medical standards. Our medicines come increasingly from our own laboratories. Even the diagnostic equipment incorporates locally developed components." A visiting journalist from Kenya's Nation newspaper appeared impressed. "And does this approach actually work in practice? Can you deliver quality healthcare this way?" Dr. Diallo smiled and pointed to the charts on the wall. Maternal mortality down 40% in 2 years. Childhood vaccination rates up to 93%. Malaria incidence reduced by a third. The numbers speak for themselves. Similar stories of pragmatic innovation could be found throughout the country. In the educational sector, a hybrid system combining digital learning with traditional knowledge transmission had emerged. Schools had become centers of community development, where students learned both academic subjects and practical skills that directly contributed to local needs. At the University of Ouagadougou, the once quiet engineering department now hummed, with activity at all hours. Students and professors collaborated on developing technologies specifically designed for Burkina Faso's environment and resource constraints. Solar-powered irrigation systems, locally manufactured medical devices, and communications infrastructure built with accessible components had all emerged from this intellectual renaissance. "What's most remarkable isn't just the innovations themselves," explained Professor Salif Cabaret, Dean of the Engineering Faculty, "but the shift in mindset. Our students no longer measure success by how closely they can mimic Western solutions. They judge their work by how effectively it serves our people's needs." On the international stage, the predicted isolation of Burkina Faso had failed to materialize in the way Western analysts had forecast. While relationships with former colonial powers remained strained, new partnerships had flourished with nations across Africa and beyond. Trade agreements with other developing countries operated on principles of mutual benefit rather than exploitation. Technical cooperation programs exchanged knowledge and expertise without the hierarchical structures that had characterized traditional aid relationships. Even more surprising to international observers was the gradual shift in tone from some Western institutions. A delegation from the European Parliament, after visiting multiple community projects throughout the country, issued a report acknowledging significant improvements in human development indicators and recommending a reconsideration of current diplomatic and economic approaches toward Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré's government had been careful to document every step of their journey, creating detailed records of both successes and failures that were shared openly with other nations. seeking similar paths to self-determination. When the president of Ghana visited Ouagadougou for trade negotiations, he publicly stated, "What Burkina Faso has achieved in 2 years forces us all to question development models we have accepted without sufficient scrutiny." The international media, which had initially dismissed Traoré's approach as idealistic and doomed to failure, now sent reporters to investigate what some were cautiously calling the Burkina Faso model. A BBC documentary titled Sankara's Echo explored the parallels between the two leaders while highlighting the different global contexts in which they operated. On a warm evening in Ouagadougou, a prestigious international award committee arrived to present Traoré with a humanitarian honor for his government's achievements in food security. The ceremony was organized in Revolution Square, where thousands of citizens gathered to witness the event. When the committee chairperson stepped forward to present the elegant crystal trophy, however, Traoré surprised everyone by graciously declining. "This recognition belongs not to me, but to the people of Burkina Faso," he stated, gesturing to the assembled crowd. "And we do not work for awards or international validation. Our reward is the dignity we have reclaimed, the self-determination we practice daily. I thank you for your recognition, but suggest that the monetary prize be directed instead to collaborative research between African universities." The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and shared across social media platforms, where it generated intense discussion about the nature of international recognition and who determines what constitutes success in development. 2 days later, in a ceremony of deeper significance to the people of Burkina Faso, a statue of Thomas Sankara was unveiled in the heart of Ouagadougou. Cast in bronze by local artisans, it depicted the revolutionary leader not in a heroic pose, but walking among the people, a book in one hand and the other extended in greeting. Beside it stood a simpler monument, not a statue of Traoré himself as some had expected, but a wall bearing the names of ordinary Burkinabe citizens who had contributed extraordinary service to their communities during the transformation of recent years. Farmers who had pioneered sustainable methods, teachers who had developed innovative curricula, healthcare workers who had served remote villages, young engineers who had created appropriate technologies, hundreds of names, etched in local stone as a testament to collective achievement. "Let this serve as a reminder," Traoré said during the dedication ceremony, "that great transformations are never the work of a single leader, but of a people united in purpose." The phrase, "Is Traoré the new Sankara?" had evolved from a media talking point into a serious topic of discussion in university classrooms across Africa. Student movements from Dakar to Nairobi adopted red berets and studied both leaders' speeches, extracting principles that could be applied to their own national contexts. In a high school classroom in Bobo Dioulasso, a 12-year-old boy raised his hand during a discussion about national heroes. When called upon, he stood beside his desk, clutching a hand-drawn poster. "For our assignment on who inspires us, I chose President Traoré," he explained, turning the poster to reveal a carefully rendered portrait. "My grandfather tells stories about Sankara, and my father says President Traoré is continuing his work. I want to be like them both, not to be famous, but to serve Africa." The teacher asked what specific quality he most admired in these leaders. "They believe in us," the boy replied simply. "They don't see Burkina Faso as poor or helpless. They see what we can become." As the classroom discussion continued, Ibrahim Traoré himself was far from the capital. He had traveled to the remote village where Thomas Sankara had once planted trees as part of an environmental protection campaign. Many of those trees now stood tall, providing shade and preventing soil erosion in an area increasingly threatened by climate change. In a symbolic ceremony witnessed by village elders and broadcast throughout the nation, Traoré planted a new seedling beside one of Sankara's mature trees. The contrast between the established tree and the fragile sapling provided a powerful visual metaphor for the relationship between the two leaders' legacies. After completing the planting, Traoré stepped back to survey the mixed forest that had grown from Sankara's original environmental initiative. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, merging the silhouettes of old and new trees into a single unified canopy. A journalist who had been permitted to document the moment asked for a final statement. Traoré gazed across the Yao, horizon where the sun was setting behind distant hills, his expression contemplative yet resolved. Then he spoke the words that would come to define not just his leadership, but an awakening consciousness across the continent. The past guides us. The present belongs to us. The future is ours. As darkness fell over Burkina Faso, lights came on in villages and cities, many powered by solar panels manufactured within the country's borders. In homes and community centers, people gathered to discuss local projects and national developments. The conversation was no longer about what had been denied to them by history or geopolitics, but what they were creating for themselves. The question that had once dominated international headlines, "Is Traoré the new Sankara?" had been answered not through rhetoric but through action. Both leaders had planted seeds of transformation. Under Traoré's stewardship, those seeds had taken root in the fertile ground of collective determination, growing into something that belonged not to any individual leader but to the people themselves. And across Africa, others were beginning to plant their own seeds.